Welcome to the Federal Adult Education Grant Application webinar. That is a mouthful. Today is Wednesday, January 19th, 2022. My name is Brad Haskamp. I'm the State Adult Education Director. And Jody?
Good morning, everyone. I am Jody Versa. My pronouns are she, her, and I am the Program Quality Specialist on the MDE Adult Ed team.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. And so Jody and I will be doing the presenting today, but we're also glad to have other friends from our adult education team at the Minnesota Department of Education. Astrid Leiden will be helping us in the chat, and Julie Dinkow is also here to make sure that we get all the information correct and that everything goes smoothly. In our agenda today, we are going to be providing a grant overview. We'll be walking through the cover sheet and the assurances. Then we'll talk about the application narrative, then the provider details worksheet. Then we'll talk about the review process. And then finally, we'll have time for more information and for questions. Couple of resources that you might want to keep track of. So two websites in particular. One is on the Minnesota Department of Education website. You'll see the Federal Adult Education Grant Opportunity details and materials on the site there. Astrid has shared the link to that site. On that site, you'll see many resources, including the cover sheet and assurances, the grant application narrative, the provider details worksheet, and the instructions document. There are some additional resources that we are sharing in this session and that you can find on mnabe.org. And that includes spreadsheets, the spreadsheet aligning school districts to regions of the state. We have some scoring rubrics or review forms, and the webinar slides that you can see there as well. So, and Astrid has shared the link for that page. We also know, though, that there are some resources that will help you complete the application. And you might want to refer to some of your past grant applications, which includes the 2017 Federal Adult Education Competitive Application, if you applied then. Your consortium's most recent 5-year narrative. You can also refer to your 2021-22 additional ABE funding application. And there might be other grant applications that you can refer to as well to help you complete this grant application. And we will be, just FYI, we will be referring to making some comparisons in this session to the 2017 Federal Adult Education Competitive Application. So you'll hear us refer back and forth and do some comparisons throughout this session as well. But let's dive in and do a grant overview first. As we've noted before, all of the grant application materials are posted on the MDE Grants website, which is already in the chat. And I just want to make sure that you're also clear. Today, we are talking about the Federal Adult Education Grant, or sometimes known as the Federal ABE Grant. We are not today talking about the Integrated English Literacy and Civics Education Grant, or the IELCE grant. We are just talking about that Federal Adult Education Grant. A little bit to kickstart, let's talk about the law. The Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act, or WIOA, is the federal law that authorizes adult education, which includes the regulations and funding for states to create an adult education system. You can see more information about WIOA implementation in Minnesota through our state WIOA plan. And Astrid, if you could share that link in the website for our state WIOA plan, that would be great. But that gives you a lot of details. Thank you, Astrid, to see how Minnesota is implementing the Workforce Innovation and Opportunity Act. And with any grant, you also are curious about funding. With the Federal Adult Education Grant, first, the federal government allocates money to states. And with that, the federal government allocates about $4.8 million to Minnesota to fund adult education programming. That's for this current year, 2021-22. And then we at the state level, we allocate this funding to grantees primarily by prior year adult enrollee contact hours. And for this current fiscal year, the federal contact hour rate is 75 cents. Quick note with that, that's extremely low. It is very difficult, if not impossible, to run a grant just off of the federal adult education funding, which is why many grantees will need to depend on other grants, whether that be state adult education funding or other types of grants to help sustain this, this work. Also, federal adult education funding pays for other things such as regional transitions work, prioritizing adult career pathway programming, and for low incidence disability aid. And this federal law, WIOA, requires that states run a grant competition for these funds. And then we define the period for those funds. The feds recommended and many states ran with a 5-year period. So we ran a competition in 2017 and are running another competition here in 2022. However, for the next time, we realized that maybe 5 years is too frequently. And so we're hoping to turn this into a 6-year cycle. That way it can fit with all of the 5-year narratives. And then our next competition is planned for 2028. And in terms of who is eligible for this grant, an organization that is seeking federal adult education funding is eligible if they have demonstrated effectiveness in providing adult education and literacy activities for eligible individuals. And that is defined by federal regulations in the Code of Federal Regulations 463.24. And Astrid has shared a link to that, to those regulations if you want to look for more detail. But this is required by the federal government. Any entity that applies has to demonstrate effectiveness. So what are the types of eligible organizations? They could be anything from a local education agency, which is a school district, or a community-based organization, a faith-based organization, a volunteer literacy organization, higher education institutions, nonprofits, libraries, public housing, and other types of organizations or consortia, or even partnerships can apply to receive this funding, as long as they have demonstrated effectiveness in serving eligible individuals. We've already shared the posting, but the one important note about the posting is those grant applications are due Friday, March 25th by 3:30 p.m. The grant applications will be submitted via email to mde.compgrants@state.mn.us. What that email needs to include is a signed and completed cover sheet and assurances, completed application narrative, and a completed provider details worksheet. One completed worksheet per provider in the application. Let's talk a little bit about the timeline for this grant. So after today, what you'll see is that on March 25th, that's our due date. March 25th to March 31st, at the Minnesota Department of Education staff, we will screen applications to make sure that everyone is an eligible applicant. Then from the end of March to May, there'll be reviewers that will be evaluating or reviewing the grants. There'll be local and governor's workforce development boards that will be reviewing the grants and applications, and the Minnesota Department of Education will be reviewing applications. So we'll have different entities that will be doing reviews. By June 1st, any applicant that wants to receive state and or federal adult education funding will need to submit an annual grant application, just like every other year, in SERVs with the required tables. More details about that annual application will be released by the end of April. And then in June, the Minnesota Department of Education will determine which applicants are approved for federal adult education funding and send notice to the applicants. Then July 1st is when the new fiscal year begins. And then in July or August, That's when approved grantees will receive your fiscal year 23 award letters with final award amounts for both state and federal adult education funds. So there are some implications about this. Please note that any provider that does not apply or any provider that does not get approved through this federal grant application process will also not receive other parts of federal adult education funding. And that includes our technology aid, which pays for access to the distance learning platforms and SID access, low incidence disability aid for those that are working with individuals with low incidence disabilities, and also regional transitions aid. And again, finally, just one last time, these are the different materials that grant application materials that you'll find on the MDE website. And we are going to now walk through each of those resources or those materials one by one. The cover sheet and assurances, the application narrative, the provider details worksheet, and the instructions document. So at this point, I am going to turn it over to Jody to talk a little bit about our cover sheet and assurances. Jody.
All right, thank you, Brad. So Brad started us off with kind of an overview and some background about these funds and this competitive grant process. And now we're going to walk through each of the 3 different documents that grantees will need to fill out in order to apply for these funds. So the first one is a document that is a cover sheet, and it also contains the assurances. So this document, there's a screenshot of it here on the left. That is what the document looks like. On this document, grantees will need to give information about the fiscal agent entity, which for many applicants we know is a school district, but for other applicants could be a different organization, such as a community-based organization. It's important to have the correct required ID numbers here in order to make sure that all of the funds can flow smoothly. And it's also important to have contact information sort of for a couple different levels of folks. It is very important to know that this application does need to be signed by your organization's Iowa or identified official with authority. For school districts, that is often the superintendent, but not always. For CBOs, that is often the executive director. So just make sure that you've got that person on board to that they know about this application process and that they're ready to put their signature on it when that time comes. You will also need information for a program manager. We often, refer to that person as the ABE manager, and that's often those of you who tend to show up for a webinar like this, sort of the person who's overseeing day-to-day programming. And then there also needs to be a contact for a business manager. So the person who's going to do the work of submitting a budget in SERVs and drawing down funds in SERVs and submitting financial reporting and that kind of thing. So that's the first part that you need on the cover sheet. Another thing that you need to do, that grantees will need to do on this cover sheet, is to indicate which region of the state are you applying to serve an area within. So we have divided the state into a number of different regions. And we have, here in the state of Minnesota, we organize our statewide adult education system geographically so that we can ensure to the greatest extent possible that individuals all over the state have access to adult ed services. So we are asking you in this application to identify which of these regions you are located within. Now we use school district boundaries to help us, organize the state, divide up the state into different parts of geography. So if you are a brand new applicant and you're not sure exactly which region your area is within, you need to be looking at the school district boundaries of where you are located. And we have provided on our mna.abe website a spreadsheet that aligns all of the school districts in the state of Minnesota with these larger regions. So you can check that out if you need that resource. And in addition to the geographic regions, we do have a way for some applicants to be able to apply to serve a statewide audience with these adult education funds. And that is intended to be for applicants that serve a particular special population that's represented across the state. And if that is the case, then those applicants need to specify which population they are applying to serve. Our most probably obvious example is that we have a current adult education provider, ThinkSelf, that specifically serves the deaf population across the state of Minnesota. So that is the next element on the cover sheet. And then after that, applicants will need to indicate the workforce service area that your geographic area covers. So this is a little bit tricky because school district boundaries don't necessarily always align exactly, or they don't align exactly with workforce service area boundaries. So we know that we have some applicants that your geographic area might actually span more than one workforce service area, and that's fine. Please make sure that you list all of the workforce service areas that are included in your geographic area. And keep in mind, we don't necessarily just mean where you have physical locations or where your buildings are, but if you look at the geographic area that you are applying to serve as defined by school district boundaries, you need to look at which workforce service areas are you serving within that geographic area. So for some applicants, that'll be just one. For some applicants, that would be more than one. And then the next part on the cover sheet is just to indicate if the fiscal agent is a 501c3. There's a little bit more information that is asked about those specific kinds of applicants. And then the last part is important, that this application must be signed by your Iowa. And yep, I see there was a question in the chat about how do we do that? It can be an electronic signature as long as your Iowa has a way to do that officially. We know there are several different ways, especially over the last few years. We've all gotten a little more adept at using these online means. But yep, it is definitely possible to have it be an official electronic signature. Another option is to print out a copy even of just that signature page and have your Iowa physically sign it with a pen, like in the picture here, and then scan that in as a PDF and attach that page along with the other required application documents. So either of those two options are acceptable. And then the other thing that's really important about the cover sheet is that this is where the assurances are. And there's a number of pages of assurances. We're not going to read through them today. We're not going to talk through all of them today, but we do want to make sure that you and your Iowa understand that the assurances are the conditions for accepting these funds. So if you apply for these funds, are awarded the funds and accept the funds, the assurances are the agreements that you have agreed to the ways in which you can use the funds, and certain limits and expectations for those funds. So none of that is brand new. None of that is substantively different from other grants, but it is important for you to recognize and understand that these are the legally binding conditions for these grant funds that are in the assurances. So worth your time to remind yourself and other folks in leadership what those assurances say. So that is everything you need to know about the cover sheet. Next, we're going to take probably the biggest chunk of time here today to talk about the application narrative. So the narrative is, of all the documents that you fill out, the narrative is the one that's going to take probably the majority of time and energy and effort. It's going to be the longest document that you submit. We have a few general recommendations as you are thinking about working on this narrative. So this first one, the first part maybe a little bit goes without saying, but as a starting point, please be sure to look at each narrative item carefully and thoroughly. Some of these items have sort of multiple pieces, multiple aspects, and you want to be sure that you are responding to all of the different components in each of the items. We encourage you, as you're developing your responses, to use the review form. The review form actually has questions for reviewers to ask themselves as they're reading your application narrative. So you can use those same questions yourself to think about, have we adequately answered or responded to these items? So we'll talk a little bit more about that as we dive more specifically into the narrative items. So our second recommendation, there is no specific minimum page count or maximum page limit, but reviewers are going to be reviewing these, and you yourself might be reviewing. We'll touch on that in a little bit. And so we just know, just to be kind to reviewers, please limit your application to no longer than 30 pages. We recognize that we have very different applicants for these funds. Some of you represent very large consortia with a lot of different programs and sites. Some of you represent smaller consortia that are more, easy to describe in fewer words. So the length of this application is going to vary, but we really don't want massively long applications from anyone, because that just becomes really onerous to review. So that's a guideline for you. And then when thinking about, I know there's a question sometimes about, should our responses talk about the past or the present or the future? So in general, unless an item specifically asks for past performance or past effectiveness, most of the time we want to hear in this application about your current practice and your current capacity. What's currently going on? What can you, what's happened in the very recent past, and what plans are you implementing for the near future? But we don't want to hear about things in the past that are over and finished and that you aren't doing anymore. We also don't necessarily want you to include things that you'd like to do in the future, but aren't really sure whether or not that's going to happen. So this is really meant to be, most of these responses should be sort of rooted in current practice and current capacity. All right, so those are our general recommendations for the entire narrative. And now we're gonna take some time to start walking through each of the sections one by one. So the first section is pretty straightforward, and it is an executive summary. So for each of these sections, we're first of all just going to give you sort of exactly the language that is in the narrative document itself. So this isn't new information if you're looking at that application. And so these are the actual items in that executive summary section. I'm not going to read it out loud for you right now, but I'll just pause for a second to make sure that you see those are the first items in that first section 1. And I do see there are some questions in the chat. We'll pause in a minute and circle back to those questions, but I'm going to keep us going. On the next slide, this is an example of how you can use these questions from the review form as you are developing your responses. So when you're responding to this item that says, describe your geographic area of service, the review form asks, is the geographic area of service or special populations served clearly articulated? So these questions on the review form are there for you to use along the way to make sure that you have that you know how reviewers are going to be looking at your response, what questions they're going to be asking, and also what the amount of points that are associated with these different items and with the different questions. So we encourage you to be using this review form as you go along. And then just a few details about section 1, which is the executive summary. For each of these sections, we'll give you a little bit of information about how it aligns to the 2017 application. I believe most of you listening in right now, either you personally or someone else in your program or your consortium, filled out the application for federal adult education funds in 2017. We do encourage you to start with that application because many of these items are similar. This section, the executive summary, the items are quite similar actually to the 2017 application. So definitely pull up that document and take a look at what was written there in 2017. However, obviously, keep in mind that you can't exactly just copy and paste from 5 years ago, particularly as I think kind of what is happening in the chat right now, everybody is pointing out our programs look fundamentally different than they did before the pandemic. And that's just reality, right? So you should certainly refer back to those responses in 2017. Hopefully for those of you who submitted that application, they will provide a good starting point for this application. But of course, these responses should include current information. So you will obviously start with that 2017 response for the executive summary, but you will need to update it. And just a note about this executive summary section, it should be brief compared to your other sections. This should not be a particularly long section. Again, how long it is might depend on the size and complexity of your consortium, but in general, this section should be shorter than the others. I'm going to pause here for a second, Brad and maybe Astrid. Are there things that we want to address in the chat at this point?
Hey, Jody. So we've had some questions just about, trying to think about, since the last years have really been affected by COVID, like how do we think about, how do we write, like, do we write, assuming hopeful beyond COVID? Are we thinking, are we able to share pre-COVID practices? And so that's a bit of the challenge that I think a lot of the applicants are asking about, is that challenge about how do we talk about COVID versus a time period where COVID precautions may not be applicable.
Yeah, I think, absolutely. We recognize that that is a challenge and that the state of things currently is in flux. Absolutely. I guess my take on that, I think this is kind of what's been happening in the chat, perhaps. My take on that is, of course, it's absolutely appropriate in this application to acknowledge that current state of, we're still transitioning, we're still adjusting. Absolutely. To me, the base guideline in this issue of focus on the current versus past or future is really just to say, if something is no longer happening and it's not going to happen moving forward, it doesn't probably belong in this application. If something isn't happening yet and you don't know whether it could happen or not, it probably doesn't belong in this application. If something is currently kind of on the table and you're doing your best and you're adjusting and you've done it recently and are working on it, those are the sort of things that belong in this application. Is there a lot of change and a lot of, variation in that? Yeah, of course, absolutely. I think we recognize the challenge. I also think every single applicant faces that same challenge. So hopefully that as a challenge isn't a particular disadvantage for everyone, but it is a challenge faced by all applicants, being able to describe that.
Thanks, Jody. And yeah, it's a little tricky and it's kind of difficult to answer, to respond to, admittedly. So I appreciate that clarification, Jody. And that's similar to what I was saying in the chat as well. There are no other big questions that we need to discuss at this point in the chat.
Okay, great. So let's keep going. So we talked about the first section, which is the executive summary. The second section of the narrative, section 2, is about diversity, equity, and inclusion. So on this next slide are the actual narrative items from this section. There are 4 of them. I'm going to give you a moment to skim over those. I'm not going to read them to you, but I'll pause for a second. All right, and I will just acknowledge that within the last few years, this has become standard practice for all grants that MDE puts out to ask grantees to speak to these really critical points in how we do our work. So on the next slide, a couple of notes and recommendations about this section. Back in 2017, this had not yet become an MDE priority for grant applications. Not that it wasn't a priority then, but it wasn't specifically included in every grant application. So you will not find a section like this from the application the last time around. However, we encourage you to take a look at your latest 5-year narrative. Because different consortia submit 5-year narratives in different years, the requirements every year change a little bit. So I can't point specifically to one item within the narrative for all of you because it depends what year you wrote that narrative. But for most of you, you had to develop some kind of a response about diversity, equity, and inclusion issues in your 5-year narrative. So you'll want to look back at that. In addition, most all currently funded consortia submitted an application this year for the additional ABE funding that was available to our system this year. And that grant application also asked for a response about DEI issues. So you may want to look back at that one as well. So those are recommendations for section 2. I think at this point, unless there's anything else in the chat, which I don't see, I'm going to hand it back to Brad to talk about section 3.
Thanks, Jody. We actually just got a question in the chat. I'm wondering if you could respond to. Jody, can you talk about how we are defining underserved populations?
Yep. Brad, do you want to go back to that slide?
Sounds good. Just 1 second here.
Items. Yep. Thank you. So yeah, good question, Tom. Keep in mind that these items are being required and requested at a level above our adult education team. So it's not specifically that our team has a particular definition that we want everyone to use specifically for adult education, because this is general grant language that is included in all grants that MDE puts out. So I think we can recognize that quote unquote underserved populations has, when you consider specifically the context of adult education, that shifts a little. But for the purposes of this application, we were not able to nuance the wording at all to be specific to adult education. So I really believe that that leaves you as the applicant in the situation where you need to think about how your organization is working towards diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how in that work you are understanding who underserved populations are in the area you are serving. So I recognize that's a little bit of a non-answer, but it's also because that's kind of our, we're kind of working with language that was given to us as well. So we're kind of passing that on to you. In a sense, it makes it easier because there isn't a very strict definition that you have to write to. In a sense, it makes it a little harder because it does mean you have to think specifically about what those definitions mean in your context. Brad, does that sound like the right answer to you? And do you have any additional thoughts on that?
Absolutely. And I want to make sure that we also are utilizing the language from the grant application or the narrative. And we're not actually using the term underserved populations. We're talking about historically marginalized populations or marginalized individuals. And like you say, Jody, absolutely. The applicant has the opportunity to define that and explain that within their answer. And just note that those that will be evaluating the response will be a team that includes an MDE reviewer plus other adult education practitioners. So thinking about that audience as your review team, you also might want to consider that as you draft your response. But it does provide a lot of liberty or flexibility to allow you to really reflect on what historically marginalized populations means. Okay. Not seeing any other questions right now. Thank you, Jody. I'm going to maybe take us into section 3. Section 3 is about need and target population. In this section, you can see here there are a couple of items. So I will give you a chance to read these 2 items here. Then within that, just a couple of additional details. So comparing this to the 2017 application, these narrative items are similar to what we asked for 5 years ago. A couple of recommendations that we have. One, we encourage applicants to articulate who the population is and provide data on that target population. And another thing we would like you to consider, please do not solely describe who your program is currently serving, but also who in your communities has a need for adult education services. So think a little bit more broadly besides who's actually walking in your doors or showing up for online programming. Think about those in your communities that have a need for adult education. And then I think we'll move into section 4. Not seeing questions. Section 4 is about provider educational capacity. This is one of the longer sections. And so there are 3 major items here that we're asking for. I'll give you a chance to read these items. Okay. Just a couple of comparison items from the 2017 application. You notice that this section is actually shorter than the 2017 application. And that is because item A from the 2017 application is now been pulled out into a separate provider details worksheet. And now this time it needs to be answered for each adult education provider within the consortium or that is included in the application. So then items B through D from the 2017 application align to items 1 through 3 in this 2022 application. A recommendation that we have for item 1, we encourage you to consider include both quantitative data, if it is available, and anecdotal evidence about services and capacity to serve individual or eligible adults with disabilities. And that can include, but should not be limited to, those with learning disabilities. Okay. Any questions at this point? Kirsten, I see your question. Question about section 3 and the evidence about civics education. In the question, it's not specifically talking about integrated English literacy and civics education, but more generally how civics education is provided within the context of adult education, especially for new Americans, correct? Yes, you are absolutely correct, Kirsten. You do in section 3, and I'll quick go back there. In section 3, regarding item number 2, evidence of need for English language acquisition in civics education, you do not need to specifically just write about IELCE or integrated English literacy and civics education. You can talk about civics education as it's embedded into English language acquisition and other education for new Americans. Great question, Kirsten. Amy Fish asks, provider is an organization that hires staff and purchases supplies, correct? So if a fiscal agent hires all the staff, there is only one provider. That is correct, Amy. And we can talk a little bit more about that when we get into the provider details worksheet. But true, a provider is defined as an organization that hires staff and not to run adult education, instruction, and services. So and in the case of Detroit Lakes or Amy Fish's consortium with the Lakes area adult education, Detroit Lakes Public Schools is hiring all of the staff And so Detroit Lakes is the only provider in that consortium. Good clarifying question, Amy. Any other questions? Okay, I'm not seeing any additional questions. Thankfully for us, we are right on time. We're almost an hour into our session. So Jody, I'm wondering if we want to do a 5-minute break and then we can start back up at about 10:25 and maybe take a couple questions if there are any questions at that point. But maybe take like just over 5 minutes for a break right now. What do you think?
Yep, I think that sounds good, Brad.
Excellent. So I think Carla, you can pause the recording and then we can take a break. Thanks, Carla. So we had a couple questions that came in during the break, and the questions are about section 2. So I'm going to just backtrack to that section briefly. Pause if this makes you nauseous as I'm skimming through slides. So there was a question about how one potentially could answer these questions. And that's a great question. Unfortunately, we can't kind of give you what answers that you could put in here. But what I will say is first, maybe you want to define or think about what does historically marginalized populations mean to you and to the work that's being done. And then you can think about, once you have that kind of understanding or that definition, then you can kind of also then look at your program and or your organizations or your consortiums population, and that could be employees, volunteers, etc., and think about like how is this group representative of Minnesotans or of your communities? How does this group of employees and volunteers and others within your program and or consortium, how do you reflect and represent various demographics or historically marginalized populations? I think that's just a little bit of reflection that each organization or each applicant will need to do and maybe kind of define. But I also would encourage others that are participating to think about how you might be defining it. And if anyone would like to share an example, either verbally or you can unmute yourself or in the chat. In the chat, we do have Karen Wolters that kind of shared, thinking about who they serve, demographic makeup, and how people benefit, move forward, the composition of staff, and also though talking about the student council, the student surveys, the focus groups that the program is doing, and how that includes the students as the voice to help make decisions. Interesting. So that is interesting. Also, then, Karen, you're talking about your district equity work as another way that could help with this response, maybe even under item 4. That seems like a very thoughtful response, Karen. Jody, anything you would add?
Yeah, I appreciate that people are asking about this. I guess I would say, to echo what Brad said, obviously we as MDE staff can't give example answers, but I would encourage you to step back for a minute and consider why this is being asked in the first place. And remember, again, this is MDE asking this of all entities out there across the state that are receiving any kind of educational funding. And I think the idea behind it is that we can recognize that it is important for staff and leadership in educational institutions to represent diverse identities. We can recognize that it's important for any educational organization to include the voices of marginalized individuals in decision-making. But we can also acknowledge that across our adult education system, we have a ways to go to make those things actual reality, right? I think we can recognize that actually in many cases, our staff and leadership don't represent particularly diverse identities. And we have sometimes struggled to include voices of the individuals we serve in positions of decision-making power. So I think these items give us all an opportunity to consider where we're at. And I think it's okay to admit that there may be some of these aspects that we are still aspiring to, but this is an opportunity to really dig deep and try to make some plans and efforts in the right direction here. So that's my kind of high level overview response to not just like how to write this response, but why these items are here in the first place and what kind of work it points to for our adult ed system.
Thanks, Jody. And then just Kirsten reflects a little bit more on section 2. It says, so they can speak of fair hiring practices, but the truth is that maybe some organizations aren't getting applicants for positions to get very representative employees or representation across the state for the population served. And that's admittedly true for many programs. We also don't hire based on representation within a particular community, but on demonstrated ability to do the job. And sometimes also I would just add, for a lot of school districts and organizations, licensure can be another big factor there. Perhaps it's particularly a rural problem. And I would say that that's, like Jody said, kind of a system-wide issue as well, not just something rural. Excellent. Okay. Not seeing any other questions right now, so I think we're going to jump. Jody, can you just confirm for me, do you see narrative section 5 on the screen now?
I do.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. Okay, so let's talk about section 5. And section 5 is educational quality. Within this section, there are a couple different questions. This is another section that gets a little longer. And the first narrative item is asking about an overview of activities and services proposed. This question gets a little bit longer. So with the federal law has defined various allowable federal adult education activities. And so for programs that could be, not surprising, one allowable federal activity for adult education funding is adult education. But also in addition to that, literacy, workplace adult education and literacy, family literacy, English language acquisition, workforce preparation, integrated education and training, or IET, and integrated English literacy and civics education, IELCE. And we just share this knowing that kind of as you respond, you should make sure that all of the activities you propose fit into one of those quote unquote buckets or categories, if you will, which should not be tough for anyone applying, I would hope. Within corrections, there is a slightly different list for corrections programs. And so and this could include if anyone is applying to work within the prisons or within the jail system, then they would kind of write to these activities. And some of these are similar, like adult education and literacy activities. Some of these are different, like special education, secondary school credit, concurrent enrollment, peer tutoring, and then transitions to reentry. So you can see there's some parallels there, but some differences. So we encourage you, as you think about the types of programs and the activities you offer, how can they fit within the various categories, whether it's a community program or a corrections program. And then in section for narrative items 2 through 4, I'll give you a chance to read through those items here. Okay. Now with some details about this section, just comparing it to the 2017 application, you'll see that item E from the 2017 application regarding content standards is now no longer a separate item, but is integrated into item 3 in the 2022 application. Some recommendations that we have. For item 1, all activities proposed should align to one of those allowable federal activities. But just note that any grantees do not need to offer all of those allowable federal activities. You don't need to have something in every category in order to be approved as a federal adult education provider or as a grantee. Also, responses to item 3 should include the grantee's incorporation of adult education content standards and can include additional best practices such as STAR, student achievement in reading, IET programming, which is integrated education and training, or other types of best practices that have been identified locally at the state level or at the federal level. We have a question in here from Denise. The categories for secondary school credit and concurrent enrollment were only listed for corrections activities. Does that mean it's not possible to have those activities outside of corrections? What about the adult diploma program? Excellent question, Denise. What I would just like to claim here, for lack of a better response, is I think it's kind of, those lists are kind of funny myself. I think we should be cognizant of them, but also it does raise many questions. And I will say that categorically, you can offer diploma programming, you can offer credit completion programming in your community-based adult education programs. In this case, though, it would just classify as adult education. It doesn't have its own special category for diploma programming. It is a little weird. I've been I think we sometimes scratch our heads at how the feds came up with these lists. And I think this was actually in the law itself. But don't worry, you are absolutely allowed to do diploma programming in your adult education program. Great question, though. And Jill Rivard is also noting that interesting that career pathway classes are noted in corrections, but not in the community list or the general list. And that's true. So you'll see that there's workforce preparation and IET and IELCE, but there is not a separate category for adult career pathway programming. So a lot of the work that we would be doing might fit. A lot of our career pathway programming would either fit in adult education, workplace adult education and literacy, workforce prep, integrated education and training, and or in the integrated English literacy and civics education. Another good catch there, Jill. Any other questions about section 5? Okay, not seeing any questions right now. Don't worry, we will have additional time for questions if you didn't get your question in at this point in time, but I am going to turn it over to Jody to walk us through narrative section 6.
All right, thanks, Brad. So moving through the narrative, we're on to section 6, which is about collaboration and contextualization. So in this section, this is again a little bit of a longer section. So we've got the narrative items split over a couple of slides here. So these are the first couple narrative items about collaboration and contextualization. So I'll give you a second to skim over those narrative items 1 and 2. So you'll see that this section is really kind of focusing on how your programming aligns to your local workforce development system, basically. And then on the next slide are narrative items 3 and 4, which are a little longer and meatier. So again, I will pause, give you a second to read through those quickly. So these items are really about how do you offer learning in particular contexts? So that could be specifically integrated education and training, or IET. It could be more broadly career pathway programming, and sort of generally helping students move on to college and living wage employment, and being full citizens of their local and larger communities. And then how do you coordinate and collaborate with other services in the community to support students as they're moving through your program and beyond. So that's kind of the gist of this section. On the next slide, a couple of details. When you look back at your 2017 application, you will see the collaboration and contextualization section there is similar, but there were a couple of items in that application that we now kind of combined together. So just keep that in mind if you're starting from your 2017 application that we've kind of made. There's one fewer item because we combined two of those items this time around. And one recommendation that we have on this section, so for items 1 and 2, which is really about how do you align to your local and regional needs, your local workforce board, your partners in local workforce, it's a good idea to take a look and be familiar with your local or regional WIOA or WIOA plan, and you may actually want to cite those plans or talk more generally about those plans. That may not be the only way that you answer items 1 and 2, but definitely something to consider as you are responding to items 1 and 2. So that's an overview of section 6. I'll pause for just a second. It doesn't look like there are any questions so far. But put any questions you have about section 6. Otherwise, we will keep going to section 7. All right, so section 7 of the narrative is specifically about program resources. And again, this is a section that has a number of different items in it, enough that we kind of split them over 2 slides. So this slide has the first couple of narrative items, and I will pause for a second to let you skim over that. So these first items 1 and 2 really touch on how are you using technology and distance learning as a resource, and what other services and coordination and support are you offering your students to help them be successful in your programs. On the next slide, we have items 3 and 4 from this section, which are pretty straightforward, but I'll give you a second to look at those. So these items, 3 is about using SID, 4 is about having healthy fiscal management procedures. So those are pretty straightforward. On the next slide, a few details and recommendations specifically about section 7. So again, if you're starting with your 2017 application, just notice there was one item that we actually just took away. So you'll see item D in the 2017 application isn't there anymore, so you don't have to worry about that one. And then a couple of fairly straightforward recommendations. When you are responding to item 3, that is the one that is basically confirm that you use SID or are willing to use SID. That can be a 1-sentence answer, probably the only 1-sentence answer in this entire narrative. So enjoy that one. And then item 4, which is about the history of fiscal management. Again, that can also be brief, but please, show us that your organization has, has a history of responsibly managing public funds. So items 3 and 4 can be pretty straightforward and do not have to be particularly lengthy. Yes, Tom, I see your comment about expanded use of technology is due to COVID, and it is somewhat hard to tell how this will lead to better outcomes. Yeah, I completely agree. Although I think one straightforward outcome is that technology allowed our students to access adult education services during the pandemic. When they would not have been able, or when they chose not to physically be present in buildings. So yeah, I agree in terms of better educational outcomes and long-term outcomes. There's a lot of that story yet to be written, but I also think we can talk about the practicalities of how technology allowed us to continue offering services when it was hard to do so in person. But yes, point well taken, Tom. Any other questions about section 7? This is actually the final section in the narrative. All right, and I think we can keep going. After those 7 sections of the narrative, then the next part is a list of providers. So the list of providers, these are the instructions, basically to list all of the providers within the that are being included in the application. And as we've already touched on at one point, but I think it's important to note again, the way we are using the word provider is to mean any organization that would receive federal adult education funding and/or state adult education funding to provide adult education services. In other words, any entity that hires their own instructors and delivers their own adult education instruction. So for this list of providers, every applicant is going to start by listing the fiscal agent organization. And as we touched on, for many of you, that is a school district. For some of you, that's a different kind of an organization. Then some applications will include additional providers that are school districts. So that's kind of one section of this list. Some applications will include additional provider organizations that are not school districts. Most typically those would be community-based organizations or 501c3 nonprofit organizations. And then it's important in this list to have a total number. So the fiscal agent is always one. Every application will have at least one provider. Some applications will have only one, but many applications will have more than one. So the fiscal agent plus any additional school district providers plus any additional non-school district providers should be the total. And then just a couple of thoughts and recommendations about the list of providers. If you are looking back at your 2017 application, you will note that this has changed. In 2017, we requested a list of all consortium members, whether or not they were a provider. For this 2022 application, we have made a change here. You do not need to list members that are not providers, or in other words, on the provider list, only members that receive adult education funds to employ their own instructors should be listed. So hopefully, please put in the chat if anybody is confused about how we're using the terms members and providers. But for this application, it's important to include only the members that are providers. And then as a check for yourself, so on this list of providers, you will have a total number. Then you need to make sure that whatever that number is, you include the same number of provider detail worksheets. In other words, for each provider that you list on the provider list, there is this additional worksheet that needs to be included, one separate worksheet per provider. All right. So, okay, I see your question, Denise. Do community-based providers submit their own separate grant application, or does it get wrapped into the fiscal agent / consortium lead? Yes, excellent question. So, in many cases, currently funded adult education consortia consist of one fiscal agent entity and some CBO or school district providers. If the intention is to continue with that same consortium structure, where that CBO entity continues to be a part of a larger consortium, then that CBO entity would not submit their own separate grant application, but would be included in the application submitted by the fiscal agent entity. However, just to kind of continue that answer a little bit, in that one application submitted by the fiscal agent, there should be a provider details worksheet for every CBO provider. So I hope that answers your question, Denise. Tracy, interesting question. Would we include the entities that receive regional transitions funds, I believe is what you're asking? For example, AEOA is the fiscal agent and Duluth receives funds to operate their programming. Yeah, excellent question, Tracy. For regional transitions funds, the way we have organized that system in the to date is that we have grouped consortia into regions, and then one consortia within the region receives all of the funds and is in charge of sort of distributing out funds if that's necessary. In that case, the consortium that receives those funds from MDE can only pass those funds on to other consortia that are also approved to receive federal ABE funding. So no, Tracy, in your application for AEOA, you do not need to include Duluth as one of your providers because Duluth is applying as their own independent consortium provider to receive their own grant from MDE for state and federal ABE funds. And therefore they would be eligible for you as the organization that manages those regional transition funds. Then you can pass them on to Duluth because Duluth is also approved. So, yep, okay, sounds like that answered that question. We can, if anybody has other questions, go ahead and put those in the chat. And then maybe I will keep going here and talk about the provider details worksheet. So the provider details worksheet is a separate document. Remember, just backtracking a little bit, remember there is the first document you have to fill out is the cover sheet document that has the assurances. The second document to fill out is the narrative application document that has all of those sections we just went through, plus the list of providers. Now, this provider details worksheet is a third separate document, and you need to complete one of these for each provider. So again, for some of you, that'll mean just one, because you only have one provider for your entire application. For some of you, this will be quite a few. We have some consortia that have quite a few different providers. So how many worksheets you need to complete depends on how many providers there are being included in your application. So on the next slide, we just want to, first of all, sort of explain why this is here. This is new. This was not included in 2017. So this is how, one way in which this competition is a little different. I won't read this whole thing, but the bolded sentence here is the purpose of this document. In order for a provider to be approved, they must provide evidence of the organization's past effectiveness and current capacity. And the rest of this, the rest of the text here sort of gives more detail about effectiveness and capacity for what and how to show that evidence. So I'll pause for a second to let you skim that. So understanding that every provider has to give evidence of past effectiveness and current capacity, let's talk a little more specifically about what kind of evidence is expected here. So for current providers, which is most of you listening in on this call, I believe, current providers that are currently receiving state and federal ABE funds, the expectation is that you would have at least some data about the WIOA indicators. So that includes measurable skill gains, it includes employment data, it includes median quarterly wages, it includes credential attainment, such as GED or high school diploma or other credentials, and it includes effectiveness in serving employers. So that's some of the data that, that we expect that current providers would have. Maybe I see your comment, Tracy, about MSG rates currently don't look very high. Absolutely, we absolutely recognize and note that this does not say, it does not set a sort of bar or a minimum in terms of how many participants earn measurable skill gains, in terms of, you know, what is the median quarterly wage after exit? There is no specific requirement there, but there needs to be some evidence that your programming has supported learners in working towards and achieving some of these goals. And yes, thank you, Chelsea. So one way, and we'll speak to this a little bit more in a minute, but yes, one source for some of this data is SLEDS, which is a data system that contains educational data across K-12, adult ed, and higher ed, and from other systems. And tomorrow we'll have a training showing you a little bit more how you can access or what kind of data you can get from that system. So yes, we do anticipate that hopefully some of that SLEDS information and SLEDS data could be useful to you here in filling out the provider details worksheet. So moving forward though, on the next slide, we do want to acknowledge that if you are an entity that is a new provider applying for these federal adult education funds for the first time, we would not necessarily assume that you have data about those that aligns to those WIOA indicators if you haven't been funded by these funds before. So in general, though, it is still a requirement to have some data and some information on past effectiveness in serving eligible adult individuals in these same areas. But we recognize in the case of new providers, it might be somewhat less specific to those WIOA indicators. And then on the next slide, we want to note on the provider details worksheet, there is an optional section. So first, there's a section where current providers are expected to include some data about work towards the WIOA or WIOA indicators. But we also recognize that there may be other kinds of data that you have that don't align exactly to those indicators, or that maybe are somewhat more anecdotal. And so there is an optional place on this worksheet where you can add that data if you would like to. So if you have some information, you have some data that you've gathered somewhat more informally in your program, or that it doesn't align specifically to those WIOA indicators, but you feel reflects the success of your programming, please do include that information in this section. If you don't have anything to include there, that's also okay. This section is optional, and it can be filled in either by current providers or new providers. And then just some recommendations on this provider details worksheet. Some ideas for where you might get some of this data from. Certainly take a look at your data in SID. You may also look at the ABE report card and other data reports that have come out of MDE. The currently being rolled out SLEDS reports. And also other data, either hard quantitative data or more kind of anecdotal story-based evidence that you have collected locally, in your own adult education programming, maybe potentially also with partner entities that are also working with your learners. So all of those might be potential sources of data. We know that SLEDS is maybe the one that you are least familiar with for those of you who are current providers, and that it is relatively new that these adult education specific reports are being included in SLEDS and they're newly available to you. So we will be doing a webinar tomorrow at 2:30 in the afternoon that will give you a quick overview of what's in those reports and how to access those reports for your consortium. So there's a link here. Astrid has put the link in the chat if you'd like to register for that event to get more information on that. Brad, or maybe Astrid, I think we got everything that was in the chat, but can you just confirm before we keep going?
Yes, everything in the chat has been addressed.
Great. So I think then, Brad, I will turn it over to you to talk about the review process.
Excellent. Thank you, Jody. Okay, so now let's dive a little bit deeper into the review process itself. We shared this timeline earlier, but just a little bit more about this review timeline. After the applications are submitted, MDE staff will screen those applications over the next week and then send them out to reviewers, to local and governor's workforce development boards as appropriate, and to and MDE staff also will be reviewing applications. And that will be from the end of March through May. In May, we will have a virtual review session that Minnesota Department of Education staff will lead with teams of reviewers that will be adult education practitioners or other volunteer reviewers. And then those groups will complete an official evaluation form for each application. And then that review team will make recommendations on which applications to approve. In early June, MDE will receive feedback from the local workforce development boards and the governor's workforce development boards on the applications. And that feedback will discuss determining alignment with their plans, strengths in the application, and any questions that those entities have, those boards have. And then in June, the Minnesota Department of Education will determine which applications get approved for federal adult education funding, and will send a notice to all of the applicants. What this means is we will need some reviewers. In February, we are going to send an email out to request reviewers across the state with our listservs. And just note that we are hoping or requesting at least one reviewer from each application or from each applicant organization. Please note that as a reviewer, you will not be assigned to review your own organization's application or region. I hope that would be clear or obvious. Also, these review sessions will be conducted virtually in May in small groups. The groups will be facilitated and led by a Minnesota Department of Education employee. This is very similar to how we do our 5-year narrative review session with our state adult education reauthorization and funding. So stay tuned for that information. These official grant review forms, there's a couple different types and different entities that will be interacting with those forms. All of our official reviewers will complete an individual review form for each application and a provider details worksheet for each provider. However, those applications will be kept by the individual reviewers. They will not be collected by the state or shared with the applicants. Review teams, though, will compile their reviews into one official review form for each application and one official provider details worksheet review form for each provider within that application. Those compiled or those official review forms will be shared with the applicants. In addition, the workforce development boards have their own review form, and those board review forms are much more simplistic, asking about alignment to their local, regional, or state plans, strengths within the application, and questions that the board reviewers had about the application. And like I said, as applicants, any applicants will receive those official evaluations or the official review forms, all official provider details worksheet reviews, and the workforce development board review. And that will be, applicants should expect to receive that in June. Now, some folks might be wondering, why would an applicant or a provider not be approved? And there's about 4 reasons why an applicant or a provider may not be approved. 1, if there's an incomplete application, basically like not all the documents are there or the majority of the questions are not answered. That would be a reason why an applicant or a provider would not be approved. In addition, if an applicant or provider does not demonstrate effectiveness in providing adult education and literacy activities for eligible individuals, that would be yet another reason why an applicant or provider may not be approved. Also, if application responses show significant lack of compliance with state and federal expectations, that would be yet another reason. And finally, this is a competition. So if there are multiple applications proposing to serve the identical school district area, and the application or the applicant had a lower score compared to a competing application, that would be yet one more reason why an application would not be approved. So some questions that folks may have. Will an entire application be rejected if one provider within the application is not approved? No, that would not be the case. What if the application is approved, but one or more of the providers is not approved? In a case like that, if one or more providers in an application is not approved, the adult education team at Minnesota Department of Education will reach out to the application's fiscal agent, the program manager, to discuss the situation. Okay, Jody, can you help me? I've kind of lost track of the chat here. Are there any key questions in the chat that we should address?
I think that we are up to date on the chat here. Eric was asking about SLEDs, and we confirmed that yes, SLEDs will have information by consortium. Denise was asking questions about what if a provider doesn't get approved, and you answered those questions right here on this slide. Maybe we can take Kirsten's question. As a provider, we are located in one WSA, but have member districts in more than one WSA. Do we send the application to the WDBs for review, or does that come from MDE? And will our local workforce development board review applications from all 3 consortia located within their service area? Good questions, Kirsten. Do you want to take those, Brad?
Great. Absolutely. Yes, good question. So as a consortium, you do not need to send your application to your local workforce development boards. We at the Minnesota Department of Education will forward them to the appropriate boards. Now, we will send, so in Kirsten's case, the consortium is in multiple workforce service areas. And so there are multiple local workforce development boards in that geographic area. While admittedly, maybe most of the service is happening in one workforce service area, we will send all applications that are covering or inclusive of that geographic area to that local workforce development board. So we will take the responsibility to do that. So what you need to do is just make sure that all WSAs, workforce service areas, that your application is covering, or geographic areas that you're covering, that should be noted on your application. And then we will take responsibility to send it out to those boards. And then those boards are expected to review applications from all the consortia within that service area. However, they are not required to submit their feedback to us. We hope that they will, and the vast majority did last time, but it's not a requirement that they send feedback for every application. I hope that was clear.
Yep, Kirsten is asking a follow-up, and then we'll circle back to other questions in the chat. So Kirsten is confirming our application will need to be reviewed and approved by more than one workforce development board.
Good question. So all applications will be sent out to each workforce development board that is within the proposed geographic area of service. That would be your member districts. But they don't actually need to approve those applications. They are invited to provide feedback, and we will consider that feedback as we make awards, but they are not required to approve or reject the applications. The boards do not have that power. They just have the power to review and provide feedback of the applications.
Yep, great. So Kirsten is acknowledging that answers her question. Thank you. I'm going to circle back to Tracy's question, which is an interesting question. Tracy asks, are you, I'm assuming MDE staff, able to let programs know if there is competition in your area?
Great question, Tracy. My understanding is that no, we cannot let programs know that there's competition within their area until the review process is complete. So we would not let you know until June if there's a competition in your area. That is my understanding. Jody, does that align with your understanding?
I think that does. Yeah, I don't think we can sort of formally notify applicants of competition. I think practically speaking, we, we're a pretty small world here in adult education. And I also wouldn't, yeah, I guess I'll just end that statement there, that no, you would not get official notification from MDE. So. Another question here, Brad, is will the questions from the chat go into the Q&A document?
Excellent question. Yes. Any question that is kind of universal or can apply to multiple consortia, those would transfer over to our frequently asked questions or our question and answer document that will be released on February 18th. If there's a question from a provider that is, or from an applicant that is so specific that it applies to their application and no other applications, then we may not include that question on the FAQ document. But for the most part, all questions will be included.
And yep, I think we've covered everything that is in the chat.
Excellent. Well, we will have more time for questions and you'll even be able to ask questions verbally here in just a minute, but let's just talk about other documents that you can use for additional information. We've already cited a lot of resources, but one document that we haven't talked about yet is the instructions document. And we just want to let you know that there are additional details about the grant, about the funding, and about the expectations in this instructions document. So I hope that you download this document and you can refer to this document as you have questions and as you are completing the application. Also, if there are additional questions that you have about this grant, the official point of contact is Neil Allard. They can be reached at their email address here, neil.allard@state.mn.us. And again, any questions received by February 11th will have answers published on the grants website page in an FAQ document on February 18th. And that is all of the content that we had in terms of items to share. So I think now we can open it up for additional questions you may have, and feel free to chat in your questions and or unmute yourself to ask your question verbally. While you're thinking of your questions, I also just want to say for any of you for any applicants, whether you're current providers, whether you're potential new providers, I really hope that this webinar has been helpful and informative for you as you prepare your application. I hope that this application process is informative and helpful. Admittedly, though, it is also kind of a federal requirement that we're fulfilling and that you would be fulfilling as applicants. And so I really thank you for your participation today. And I look forward to addressing any other questions in the future. And good luck to everyone that is applying for this grant. Jody, anything that you would add?